Okay, we got Colin Liddell joining us. Colin, if you can unmute, tell us what you've been thinking about recently. Any news stories that have grabbed your attention?
Yeah, well, I guess everybody's eyes have been on the, correcting centuries and centuries of racial injustice in the last few days by basically trashing city centres, pulling down statues, setting fires to Wendy's, and so on. So this is really changing hearts and minds, I think.
Now, did this surprise you? Did this go further than you expected?
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit surprised by things, So I've been sort of like rethinking some of my ideas. A lot of what's happening now, it really looks like leftist overstretch. But there's surprisingly little backlash against it, and the whole establishment really is allowing this to happen, and whether wittingly or unwittingly, because there's so many conspiracy theories around now. But whether wittingly or unwittingly, the establishment is actually empowering things that we've been seeing, like this recent shooting. This was caused by this black man. I think it's in Atlanta.
Yeah.
This was caused by this black man having a bit of an attitude towards these police officers. He couldn't believe that two white police officers would dare to arrest a privileged human being like himself. And so he started, cutting up rough, and one thing led to another, and bang, he's dead. And now, more fast food joints are in flames.
Now, according to the polls, Black Lives Matter is enjoying dramatically increased support. Do you think that's real?
Well, it's as real as anything is real in our present society. If they had a decade-long campaign to tell you that breathing was satanic, eventually people would start holding their breaths. There's a lot of gaslighting, there's a lot of astroturfing, and then once you get all the media on board and you get all these corporations chiming in, and you've got all these politicians, the situation in London sort of springs to mind right now, because there was probably the ill-advised football lads march supposedly to protect the monuments in London, and it was so noticeable the difference between how this event and the events by Black Lives Matter were policed. The previous week, Black Lives Matter, they were allowed to run rampant around the centre of London, defacing things, doing what they liked. A young black guy climbed up on the cenotaph, tried to set it on fire. Meanwhile, the police were just like down below, gently talking to him. There was no effort made to just yank him down and arrest him. And the police were all, wearing their soft caps and sort of kneeling before the BLM activists and the Antifa and all the other scumbags who were out in force. And then when the crowd got a bit leery, they had very few defenses against these rioters, and so they kind of in most cases ran away. And then in the more recent example of the football lads, they were all fully kitted up. They had helmets, they had batons, they had all sorts of weapons, mace, all sorts of things. They were ready for a riot. And this is against people who have very little inclination to, riot with the police. They're there on a patriotic protest to protect statues. So they've come to do something that is intrinsically very orderly. They're there to cooperate with the police, and the police are there to fuck with them and to provide cover for violent left-wing thugs to launch attacks on them. Most of the images of violence seem to show black on white violence. Instead of focusing on that, you have all these misleading headlines, and then the media is focusing on this case of a man who apparently whittled next to a monument to a police officer who was killed a couple of years ago trying to stop a mad black Islamic terrorist.
Yeah, so I notice a lot of people on the right, a lot of Trump supporters right now are quite black-pilled. Do you have any reaction to that reaction?
Well, I don't know. People being black-pilled is so boring. I mean, it's just like, what's the point of that? I mean, just try to be objective and, make your decisions accordingly. I can understand why people would be black-pilled because most people tend to have unrealistic expectations. And I mean, I think Trump has been a bit of a crash course in that. You know, when Trump came in, I was very skeptical even at the beginning about what Trump would achieve and whether he would be any better than Hillary. In some ways, having Hillary in the White House would have been better for the dissident right. So I was very skeptical, but most people seemed to get carried away by this euphoria, which is understandable because it's a bit like the pent-up demand created by the coronavirus shutdown. People on the right wing were in a kind of ideological shutdown for several decades, and so when Trump got in, things went to their head a little bit. So it's understandable. People are very emotional. They react to things in a very emotional way, and then they have very unrealistic ideas about how the world works and what to expect. And then when things don't quite go their way, they tend to, the pendulum swings the other way, and they get a bit too morose. We are seeing quite an interesting thing, I think, because the whole society has been slowly cooked to this point over decades, and this anti-racism cult, I guess you could call it, this anti-racism cult is really necessary to the present existing order because our society is so fractured in the West. It's so ready to fall apart. And if it fell apart, that would damage so much of our not our power. It would damage so much of the elite's power if it fell apart. And so they're willing to do almost anything to stop that happening. And the only glue to keep this, disgusting mess together is this anti-racism culture, this let's guilt trip white people because they seem quite susceptible to that. And let's bang on about all the injustice to keep them on the back foot, and that enables them to go on with this deeply divided society.
Yeah. So one of the leading characteristics of pundits is that they typically overreact to everything that happens, and I think the blackpilling is part of the overreaction. I found it interesting for the first week or so of the George Floyd riots, the stock market actually went up. So the people with hundreds of billions of dollars to invest, they did not apparently believe that the riots presaged a return to skyrocketing rates of crime. They apparently think that the country is going to be okay. How important a measure of future confidence in the country do you think the stock market is?
I think the stock market is as kind of like insane and irrational as most large groups of people. I don't think you should put too much faith in what the stock market seems to be saying. The stock market represents blind economic forces of a kind of with a kind of short-term focus. I think it's not the way to build civilizations and things that last forever. So I think there is. I think what you alluded to there was that because the protests were going to bring about the collapse of the shutdown, that was sort of stimulating some sort of rally, and we've seen it since then. We've seen it drop back a bit. So the stock market doesn't really seem to know what's going on. I mean, it has been pushed down quite a lot back in March, and so it is starting to recover. And you can be sure that the stock market will recover because there's been all this quantitative easing brought on by the coronavirus shutdown. So all that money has to go somewhere. It's going to end up in the stock market as usual. But that doesn't really mean that the stock market is an indice of a healthy economy or healthy society. I think we're seeing some very, very kind of negative trends. We have a very, very divided society, and the short-term answer to that very, very divided society is to double down on anti-racist bullshit. and that's what we're doing. And meanwhile, that just papers over the cracks. If they really cared about how disunited and divided society was, they would have taken measures like decades ago to ensure healthy demographics and a unified society that had a shared culture. Instead, we've developed into a very divisive society where everything's about identity politics, where everything's about blaming other groups, and it's getting impossible now to envisage a kind of sane, united America with a unifying culture.
Now, Richard Spencer hailed Raz for setting up an autonomous zone in Seattle. He tells him, way to go, follow your heart. What do you think about people setting up an autonomous zone in Seattle? Do you wish them to follow their hearts?
I think Spencer was implying that there's some sort of lack of confidence in the West. There's a power vacuum, and this apparently this black genius Raz was he was this visionary leader who had seen this historical opportunity, and it's just usual Richard Spencer twaddle. It kind of sounds kind of a bit funny. It sounds kind of interesting, but if you go through it with a fine-tooth comb, it's just the usual pile of crap. This is basically the Democrats trying to create turbulence to kind of shift Trump out of office. I think that their game plan seems to be to sort of create a feeling of chaos and instability and general shrillness and shrieking, so that people will think, if we vote for Trump, we're going to have 4 more years of a very deeply divided society that's going nowhere, where everybody's angry, where everybody's hateful. And so then under those conditions, a lot of people might, especially a lot of the floating voters, the people in the middle, a lot of those voters might just consider like, okay, just for a quiet life, Joe Biden looks like the best choice. So I think it's just another aspect of American politics, really. It looks like it's the first round of the presidential election.
Yeah, and so there are obvious two possibilities about how this plays out in the 2020 presidential election. One is the precedent of 1968, when people were tired of disorder and they voted for law and order, Richard Nixon. Or the other possibility is 1992, when people were tired of George H.W. Bush and voted in Bill Clinton. So I think generally speaking, people react to rioting and looting by a preference for law and order. So one would think that would be the primary reaction. I've heard a lot of liberals, including Moore, who's that documentary filmmaker, Moore, who thinks that these riots and looting will get Trump reelected.
Well, that fat guy, is it Michael Moore?
Yeah, Michael Moore, yeah.
It's possible that, because a lot of what we're seeing, it is really, like I said earlier, there is a kind of astroturfing element to our culture now. The left completely dominates the media, completely dominates social media and academia, and the corporations are all woke now, and so it looks like our culture is moving a certain way. But underneath that, there could be this kind of normie reaction to disorder, and they could swing towards Trump. But Trump's looking weak. He's not looking strong, and he can't go in. He can't go in too hard. First of all, he doesn't control these cities. These cities are controlled by Democrats. So, they're allowing this disorder to exist. And Trump and that's actually making Trump look weak, because all he can do is Twitter about it. So I think it's unlikely that there'll be such a strong backlash against the riots and what the Democrats are pulling off here. It's not going to be 1968 all over again, I don't think. So I would be saying that the way it looks at the moment is that Trump's going to look weak. He's going to alienate a lot of his own supporters, because he's not being the kind of strong man that he kind of he talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. So he's not really being the strong man. He's sort of constantly devaluing his own currency by tweeting and then doing nothing. And then at the same time, a lot of people who are just sick of the divisiveness are going to assume that's somehow related to Trump. And I mean, the Democrats will probably have a whole host of other dirty tricks up their sleeves. So I'm not really seeing much pushback from the Trump administration. It is looking a bit jaded, a bit passive.
One thing that strikes me about pundits, generally speaking, is how useless they are, how they overreact to events. And the successful ones are usually successful because they tell the audience what it wants to hear, as opposed to someone like yourself, whose responses are far more measured, far more thought through, but they just don't have the emotional, visceral impact of someone who knows how to whip up an audience's emotions by playing on them and telling them what they want to hear. So as someone who does give thoughtful insights on what's going on in the world around them, how do you then look at the people who make a living from this by essentially running a con game, essentially working the prostitution angle of just supplying people with the emotional material that they want to hear to feel a certain way?
Well, they have to also supply a certain amount of information as well to do that. So these pundits, they have to have some kind of eye-catcher narrative. Otherwise, people are going to hear too much nuance and too much pros and cons, and most people can't handle that kind of subtle complexity. So they need something a little bit garish. And that will also include a lot of information about what's going on. So you listen to these pundits, but you have to always bear in mind that they might be sort of exaggerating in one direction for effect. But at the same time, it draws you in and it involves you in the issues and the events, and so you do pick up a lot of information from that. But ultimately, everybody's got to be their own pundit, and most people are sadly unqualified for that.
Yeah, it's striking. I've been reading a lot about TV punditry, radio punditry, talk radio, and it seems like the essential quality is that you evoke a strong emotional reaction in the listener or the viewer by being completely sure of yourself. It seems that that's what radio programmers, TV programmers want, is that they want someone who's going to give opinions who is completely sure of themselves. And of course, to be completely sure of yourself about the meaning of the news of the day is delusion. And when you look at the upshot of 99.9% of pundits, they don't add a whole lot of light. So it's funny, the very requirement for making a living at that occupation is a cocksuredness that militates against thoughtful consideration.
Yeah. People want some kind of reassuring certainty. I mean, what else is new? That's just gonna be the name of the game. And also, if you have an interesting take, that's another bonus. And the more sure and the more interesting your take, the more certain it is to be wrong. And I'm absolutely 100% sure about that.
Yeah, it's just stunning how there are all these kind of built-in incentives in life for people to behave in an antisocial way in all sorts of areas, not just in punditry, but for pundits to sound so cocksure about things that they know very little about, it surely has an antisocial effect. How much influence do you think the news media has on the way people view the world?
That's really hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think most people, they live a little bit beneath the news. They don't really pay too much attention to it. They're pretty much low information. Certain things will grab their eye. They might check the headlines. It's kind of hard to say, and it varies from place to place. I think in some countries, like in Western countries, like in Britain, and I think America very much so, people tend to be very skeptical about the media. In Britain, people distrust the BBC more and more every year. The BBC used to have a very positive image when I was a child. And I think they've really frittered that away over the years. People want to hear what they want to hear. They want to hear coverage and news and read things that reinforce their view of the world. And so, yeah, the basic audience of the news is much more fractured. And if the news isn't saying exactly what you want them to say, you tend to start viewing them in an increasingly negative way. So it's getting harder for countries to have respected, objective news sources. Amongst all the news channels that I've occasionally watched on the internet or when I'm traveling, Al Jazeera seems to be the best in that they tend to have more news content. They have more factual content. They have less opinion. That's not to say they don't have any opinion. When I watch the BBC or CNN, it sort of reminds me of North Korean news coverage. It has that same tone. It's just like the way that we've seen some very, very blatant examples of how twisted the reporting is during the events of the last few days. So it is a very good demonstration of that. But this is something, of course, that people in the distant right have been very, very far ahead of the curve on.
Now, I think your analysis is superior to every working pundit out there. Does it bother you that hundreds of people are able to make a good living with their opinions that aren't particularly wise, and someone such as yourself, who has far more important things to say, is not as blessed?
I think I'm pretty blessed. I'm not going to complain. I mean, I do all right. Some of these pundits, I don't know, maybe they can't sleep at night after all the bullshit they spout. I don't know. If they can make a living out of it, but of course, they're making a living by increasing the amount of untruth in the world. I mean, they are pushing things in the wrong direction. We need a culture that respects the truth more. And again, that's a problem because everybody's going to disagree about what the truth is. Facts, data, reason, logic. I mean, we've all been in situations where we've bombarded people with facts, data, logic, and reason, and we've been sort of half amazed that it's had so little impact on them. So I think the internet's a kind of a good example of how people are never really going to be capable of higher thought, higher civilization, unless we find some sort of way to completely genetically redesign them.
I've been thinking about a time in community college when I backed down on my politics because I didn't want people to think I was not cool, and kind of gave in to peer pressure. So you've been marginally a part of the alt-right scene. How have you dealt with keeping relationships, keeping friendships, maintaining income, social relationships, whatever, on the other hand, and versus saying what you believe to be true? Have you not felt the tug of swallowing what you believe to be true to preserve relationships, or have you always just said what you believe to be true and then let the consequences flow?
What I believe to be true, I don't really think it's extreme or nasty or evil in any way. But we're starting to reach a situation where even having quite mild views on a lot of things, even like being vaguely patriotic or not being apologetic about the evils of being a white person, even things like that, which would have you would have thought would be entirely defensible. We're reaching a point where even those kinds of attitudes are now being seen as somehow toxic and evil. And so you've got to really, I would advise a lot of people in the dissident right to try to be a lot more subtle, to try to be a lot more cryptic, and to definitely veer away from making things too blatant. So we have to develop a lot more coded language. We have to talk about things in a less inflammatory way. We have to, we have to go a little bit more undercover. I think that's probably a good thing at the moment, because we are effectively living in a society and a culture that is going insane to a large degree. I mean, some of the things surrounding Black Lives Matter. I mean, one of the things that struck me in particular was Little Britain. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this comedy series. This is a very, very popular comedy series, I think in the early zeros. I can't really remember exactly. I think it was the early zeros. It was put out by the BBC, which even at that stage was quite politically correct about a lot of things. And you have this kind of sad spectacle of the two main comedians involved in the show abjectly apologizing for the evil crime of playing non-white characters. I mean, this is such a ludicrous thing, and it's just like, and everybody's on board with this. And then the other thing, like J.K. Rowling, she has a problem with this transsexual idea of women. The idea that a man can just identify as a woman and then walk into a women's restroom and sports team and whatever, So she just raised very kind of, she's a feminist. She's a very left-wing person. I mean, she's all behind a lot of these woke causes. But because she's not on board with this one extreme idea that men can be women, she's suddenly being treated as a second Hitler now. So it's just, there is a lot of hysteria around. And there's very little opposition to it at the top of society. We're not seeing politicians come out and, make strong stands against this. We're not seeing corporations backing people who are just, resisting this kind of nonsense. There's nobody resisting it at the top levels. I mean, lower down, the normies, they know this is all crazy, but they're thinking, wait a minute, maybe I should just keep my mouth shut. And so that's the way the wind's blowing. That kind of attitude seems to be catching on. So I don't know where the backlash is going to come from in this case. Maybe we need something like a Muslim uprising, to reassert certain basic facts of human biology.
One thing I notice, there's a dramatic qualitative difference in the commentary by people who have published extensively and those who haven't. It seems that a lot of the thought leaders on the alt-right, for example, they just make a lot of podcasts, but they don't have any publishing background. Those with the publishing background, they're able to formulate their thinking much more clearly, that there's absolutely no substitute for writing for developing clear thinking. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I've told you my thoughts on this probably several times. And one of the things I remember saying to you is that when you speak and when you write, there's quite an IQ difference. A person's written word will exist at a higher IQ level than a person's spoken output.
Yeah, that's a good point. You have spoken to me about that several times. And another thing that I noticed about thought leaders on the alt-right is that they've overwhelmingly tended to get captured by the applause, and the applause is basically proportionate to how extreme they go. So the more extreme they go, with some qualifications, the TRS crowd, for example, have toned it down a bit since Charlottesville. Now Andrew Anglin has toned it down a bit, but there has been a tremendous temptation to get seduced by applause by, I think, many of the alt-right thought leaders, and they've been seduced into very destructive ways of speaking and acting. Any thoughts on the seduction of applause?
Yeah, also they're getting seduced by a lot of anonymous applause, and you don't actually know who's given the applause. I mean, what I noticed was that a lot of this kind of applause in the distant right, or the alternative right as it was a few years ago, was from very, very suspicious sources. There seemed to be a lot of kind of fake accounts, a lot of bot accounts, a lot of sinister hands behind the curtain, really, and so the alt-right was being encouraged to become more and more, ridiculous, absurd, and insane. So it wasn't an entirely organic thing. There's a lot of underhanded methods being used to direct and influence the political and the metapolitical culture.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to you because I'd never know what you're going to say. Like, I can have a rough idea, but you continually surprise me, but not in the obvious, hot take manner of Richard Spencer, who I do listen to because I do often enjoy listening to his hot takes, but yours seem to come from a place of a consistent worldview, but it's not so consistent that I can predict what you're going to say. Do you have any thoughts on the rioting in the United Kingdom, the tearing down of statues there? Any differences between what you see happening in the United Kingdom, perhaps, and what you see happening in the United States?
Well, one thing that strikes me is sort of how kind of culturally colonized the UK is. This is something that happened in America, and all right, there's all sorts of long-running issues stoking up all this racial tension in America, and you can see how this could play out in such and such a way. But then it sort of leaps the Atlantic, and the next thing you know, British people are up in arms and tearing down statues, and our politicians are cucking as much as American politicians. Our media is as much on board with this whole thing as the American media. It almost looks like the whole world is controlled by some concerted operation. And I mean, this is going to push a lot of people into conspiratard thinking. It's unavoidable. Yeah.
You had a great tweet in response to a Ramsey Paul video. Ramsey made a video saying that multiracial empires cannot last, and you had a great tweet. You talked about this as a mid-IQ take. In fact, multiracial empires can last for many, many centuries. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. There are a lot of people in the alt-right. They're more active, like tweeting things or making ill-informed content than they are in sort of actually getting a proper education. And for this sort of thing, what you need is a very deep ground in history, and that does take some time to acquire. And you have to have a very good sense of time and space and geography and various things. And one of the most ill-informed things that the alt-right often says is that this is based purely on how they see America in the present day. Is that multicultural societies all collapse? Like they can't survive, they can't exist. And this is complete bullshit if you know any amount of history, because the Habsburg Empire, how long did that last?
Right. And Russia.
That's actually a question.
Oh, yeah, I'll look it up, but hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, Russia. Russia is a vast multicultural society. They just they do their multiculturalism a little bit differently from America, and it's not quite as asymmetrical as America's multiculturalism, of course, because they don't have the black problem to the same extent. China too is a vast multicultural society. They seem to be using kind of a mixture of concentration camps and social engineering to hold on to some of their more diverse outlying regions. The Roman Empire was a vast multicultural empire that lasted for nigh on 1,000 years, depending on where you draw the lines. So these multicultural, multiracial societies, the British Empire is another one. These can last. It all depends upon how they're organized, what kind of ideology they have, who is the dominant group, how the dominant group behaves, etc., etc. Under Western consumer egalitarianism, multiculturalism doesn't seem to have a very bright future. So that point should definitely be taken.
Right. When I talk to academics who are sympathetic to the alt-right, they also say I haven't learned anything from the alt-right because the general quality of the thinking is so shallow. But there is great news for nationalism. Millennial Woes is back on Twitter. What do you think that presages for Western civilization?
No, that's news to me. I'll have to check him out. What handle is he going under this time?
Oh, I'll have to look it up again. I clicked to follow him, and then he promptly banned me. So,
yeah, that's good news. It sounds like when Woes comes back on Twitter, it probably means that maybe after the first few hundred tweets, he might be thinking about making another video. And then after he makes a few dozen videos, then probably he might do a speaking engagement. And so we're probably only about 5 million tweets and 300 YouTube videos away from millennial woes saving Western civilization. That's good news indeed.
And he's using the name Merwin Waters. And I think if we just give him a bit of encouragement and tell him how much we appreciate his work, encourage everyone to donate to him, give him encouragement, buck him up, empower him to do the important work that needs to be done.
Yeah. I mean, he's obviously a very talented, guy, and a lot of people love him. So good for Woes.
Yeah, you can't keep a good man down. What do you think about the possibility of Christianity helping to unite a fractious nation like the United States of America?
Well, God Almighty, yeah. Well, they need something to try to unite the country in the long term. Christianity is not really a unifying force. I mean, Christianity is one of those ideologies that can do whatever the people in power tell it to do. It's not going to be able to unite the country, though. You need something much more solid. You need to have really shared values about a lot of things. And in America, it's very, very hard. I mean, America could maybe stay united if they force everybody to miscegenate so that nobody knows who the fuck they are. So if you don't know which ethnic or racial group you belong to, it might be a little bit tricky to get started on the identity politics and then to fracture society. So maybe that's what they're going for, a kind of neo-Kalergi plan. But I don't think that's actually working, because blacks and whites are becoming more and more polarized, I think, because of the present situation. There's a lot of white people who are signaling really, really hard about Black Lives Matter, but they're not really taking the necessary steps to sort of follow through on that, which is like moving to a black neighborhood and sending their kids to black schools and then also intermarrying with blacks. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, people fundamentally, in general, don't tend to care about outgroups unless they can use their caring for outgroups to promote their own social status and to show that they're better people than their competitors. Would you agree with that, that generally speaking, people don't care about outgroups unless they can use their caring to virtue signal?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing in America is this whole Black Lives Matter, one way to look at it, one way to frame it, has a weapon in a long-running inter-ethnic war between different groups of whites. I mean, America used to be this WASP country, and then you had various kinds of Catholics and Southern Europeans and Mediterranean people and Jewish people coming in who didn't feel quite accepted, who felt that the game was stacked against them. And so blacks are part of that kind of inter-ethnic rather than interracial conflict as well. I mean, there is a legitimate, separate strand of interracial conflict between blacks and whites, but also there is a lot of inter-ethnic narratives playing into this and playing upon it. So America didn't actually bother to achieve unity before going into this new period of racial chaos.
So much of reality bewilders me. It never occurred to me that there would ever be a movement for same-sex marriage, and then it never occurred to me that there would be such a transsexual rights movement. And now I'm completely bewildered by this fairly widespread movement to defund the police. What do you make of this movement to defund the police?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's not really defunding the police. It's more like an attempt to restructure the police and to gain more control over the police, and maybe to break some of these police unions. It's all predicated on this kind of moral shield of Black Lives Matter, and we've got to remember the holy life of George Floyd. And using this as a battering ram, they're going to radically shake up how policing is done. So I can see a situation arising where a lot of very talented police officers decide that they've had enough, and maybe they should look for a change of career, maybe work in private security, do something else. And a lot of police departments are going to end up policing in a much more softly, gently way. And, from the leftist point of view, this is great because, the leftist believes that in order to get the best out of people, you've got to be nice to them. And if you just treat, these black gangbangers and criminals with the utmost respect and deference, they're going to reciprocate. And so we're going to see a very interesting social experiment when they start to roll out these these new police forces. I can maybe predict that cities like Minneapolis and what's the other one?
Oh,
well, there's several cities
Seattle.
which are yeah. Is it Seattle? Yeah, Seattle. There's quite a few others that will probably be joining the queue shortly. And these cities, they're all going to. I mean, I think Minneapolis is a largely white city. I think is it?
Yes.
It's about 75% white.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I think Seattle's pretty much a white city as well. I'm not sure the exact percentages, but these cities are going to probably go through something analogous to Detroit, I can imagine, and maybe what will happen is you'll get a lot of white flight, and then instead of going all the way down to Detroit levels of chaos, you might see the Hispanics move in, and that might create an interesting dynamic. So there's a lot of interesting things that are going to happen in America in the next few decades. And I think one of the big questions is how are the Hispanics going to make themselves felt in American society and in American culture? Because, even though the Hispanics are now a bigger group than blacks, culturally and in terms of what people see, America is still very much, this mainly white country with a black problem. So I think we're going to see, a lot of interesting developments there. The Hispanics also, it's well known the Hispanics, because they occupy a kind of similar niche in society to the blacks. They have a lot of competitive urges there. There's a lot of interracial, interethnic tension between those two groups. And that could also play out in some interesting ways, because if the Democrats are the party of the blacks, that might push a lot of Hispanics into the GOP camp. But we'll have to wait and see on that.
Yeah, I wonder how much Latinos and Asians enjoy the Democratic Party being dominated by blacks. Do they really want to be a part of what's become the Black Party?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that are in there now, they've kind of come up through the system and they know the score, and so they kind of go along with it. But there must be a lot of Hispanics who are thinking, is this really the party for us? And we should have much more of a say. And so there must be some interesting tensions going on, and this is something we'll probably see a lot more of in the next 10 to 15 years.
Why do you think the left is so effective at? They've won on almost every cultural issue. They've been very effective at driving away advertisers for right-wing thought that they find unacceptable. For example, Tucker Carlson. They've been able to drive away advertisers when Glenn Beck was on Fox. Where do you think eventually every cultural conflict in the West that the left has won?
Yeah, that's a big question, and probably has a lot of various answers. And one thing that springs to mind though is that in terms of economics, the left is completely lost. And so if you go back to like the 1970s, say, you still had a large, powerful economic left in most countries. And I'm thinking mainly of the British example. In Britain, you had Labour governments which had left-wing policies, you had nationalised industries, and so on. And then this all changed in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, you had the rise of neoliberalism. You had the left kind of surrendered on economic issues, more or less. And what happened in the case of Britain, which was very noticeable to me, was that the culture then became much more leftist. So it's more like a kind of caste system. So, like, you have left-wing people and right-wing people. Right-wing people they found businesses, they make money, they get rich, they dominate the economic realm. Left-wing people, they go into academia or the media, and they then dominate that area. So it's more like a kind of caste system. So from about the 1980s onwards, British culture started to swing more to the left as the society generally and economically swung to the right. And so this is when the BBC started to become much more of a kind of left-wing sanctuary. And you can see the same thing even in rock music. That's when you started to have increasingly woke rock musicians like Bono and Live Aid and Rock Against Racism and all this stuff. And so this was very, very noticeable. So it might be because the left completely lost the economic war, and so all the kind of leftist types in society have kind of migrated and colonized the culture like a kind of particularly nasty rash. Yes,
that's interesting. Now, public health officials, they've not had a particularly good 2020. Many of them were quite late. Many of the epidemiologists were quite late to grasping the seriousness of COVID-19. Then they told people that you need to socially distance and wear masks. And then many of them come out supporting these Black Lives Matter rallies. Do you think there'll be any repercussions? What? My bloody producer's down at the park having some gay sex, and my light keeps falling off. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. I guess that's a good point at which to
wait. Just a thought on public health officials and politicians telling people to socially distance, and then they completely do away with those guidelines when it comes time for Black Lives Matter rallies.
Yeah. Well, Eurasia has always believed in not wearing face masks.
Yep. Okay. Thanks a lot, Colin. Anything you want to mention before you leave?
Oh, no, nothing particular. Just, check out the sites, Affirmative Right and Trad News. Right,
thanks,
good night.
Colin. Take care. Good to talk to you, Colin.